Apologize on that last one there. It looks like the lyrics froze. We had someone falling asleep back there. No, we won't pick on anyone this morning. Technical difficulties happen. It is okay. Well, with that being said, with our hearts open and full of worship and praise, would you open your Bibles to Paul's letter to the Galatians? We're in Galatians chapter 1. And we're going to be looking at verses 11 through 17, since we've recently started just a few weeks ago. And you can see I've titled the message this morning, From Jesus to Paul, the Gospel Revealed. So follow along with me as I read, beginning in verse 11, and then we'll jump right into the text. For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel, for I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, so extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. No doubt many of you have heard or even read a very popular devotional book by Sarah Young called Jesus Calling. Came out in 2004, and subsequent revised editions, a lot of children's books, etc., studies have been launched from it. It sold 15 million copies total. A phenomenal success by any definition of the word. And the reason why it was so successful is because the unique perspective in which it was written. You see, she wrote the book from the perspective in the first person, as though Jesus himself is speaking to the reader. And that's what she says from the outset in the introductory matter if you read it. She says, whenever you see the me or my or me first person, that's Jesus. And whenever you see the you, that's you, the reader. And she talks about how in her private prayer life, in her devotional life over the years, she had wanted something more beyond than what the Bible actually says. She wanted to hear God's voice. And so as she began journaling and praying with pen in hand, she said she began to listen, to hear the voice of God. And then she would write down what she thought she heard him telling her in her own mind. And so she's writing the very words of Christ, as it were. And though she wouldn't use this kind of language to say that she has received the kind of divine revelation that the apostles and the prophets and those who were inspired and guided and directed by the Holy Spirit to record what God intended them to record, his message in Scripture, both the Old Testament and the New, she's basically saying that in other words. Because if you're saying that what I'm writing are the words of Christ, and I'm hearing him tell me this, that's divine revelation. That's special revelation on the level of the biblical writers. And there have been many Christians, or people, I should say, throughout church history that have claimed to have divine revelation from God. Whether new revelations, whether words of knowledge, whether prophecies. There have been many. But we know that the only people that can claim that truthfully and accurately are those 40 people, the men, whom God uniquely chose to record His revelation, His message for humanity on the pages of Scripture, Old Testament and New. 39 books in the Old, 27 in the New, 40 writers over the space of about 1,500 years, which we can trust and know and believe as gospel is from God. That we know. But sometimes people would claim divine revelation because it's the easiest way to get people to believe your message, right? If you can get them to believe it's from God, it's more persuasive and they're more likely to believe it. And Paul was just such one of these writers, these 40, who wrote 13 letters in the New Testament, one of which we're looking at now and have been for the past few weeks, his letter to the Galatians. And on top of him being used by God to write inspired scripture, he also had other kinds of special revelation that were unique to the 12 apostles because he got to see the risen and glorified, resurrected Jesus Christ, didn't he? And that is precisely the special revelation that he appeals to this morning in the text. He appeals to that revelation as the basis by which the Galatians can trust that his message is from God, because his calling is from God, and he received the message from the risen Christ directly, just like the 12. So the Galatians don't have to wonder about the accuracy and truthfulness of his message, and by extension, neither do you and I today. We can believe it. And we need to believe Paul's gospel above and beyond any other supposed gospel, like the Judaizing gospel. No, it's a gospel of grace by which we're justified by faith, nothing we could do to add to it or contribute it, but God has graciously given his Son for us in our place. And we can believe that. And we need to believe that. And that's what Paul appeals to here in his continued defense. We've been talking about that, right? To bring those of you up to speed, zooming out a little bit so we can keep the main purpose and the message for which he's writing. And it is this: letters are situational. We talked about that. The writers are addressing particular situations in the early churches that had arisen, and they want to give answers to questions. They want to correct bad theology, bad behavior, bad doctrine, whatever the case is. And in the case of Galatians, false teachers known as Judaizers from Jerusalem had crept into the Galatian churches. They had infiltrated in sneakily, and they had managed to persuade the Galatians to disbelieve Paul's gospel and to believe theirs. They were saying, well, don't believe Paul. The best way to discredit someone's message, by the way, is to discredit them as a messenger. So what were they saying? Paul's not a real apostle. He wasn't one of the original 12. Plus, he changes his message from audience to audience when he goes from church to church. He said it himself: when I'm with the Jews, I live like the Jews as one under the law, and when I'm with the Gentiles, not so. And that's why he left out circumcision, they're saying. That's why he left it out. But he knows that's the actual gospel. Right? These are the Judaizers. They were Jewish Christians, guys who wanted both Judaism and Jesus. They said, yeah, we accept, we believe Jesus as the risen, crucified Messiah. But you also need to keep the law and our traditions, and the law as evidenced by the sign of the covenant, circumcision. You need to keep that too. And Paul knows that. So don't believe his gospel, believe ours. And Paul's furious. He's furious at these Judaizers for putting words in his mouth, righteously indignant, probably as righteously indignant as Jesus is for Sarah Young putting words in his mouth. And he starts to pen this letter. He pens this letter to correct this deadly and damning error. It's no small thing to add to the gospel. We can agree to disagree on secondary issues, on tertiary issues, on ecclesiology and what your understanding of the church is and church leadership, on eschatology and your understanding of the unfolding of history in the end times according to end times prophecy in the Bible. But the gospel is a non-negotiable. Paul knew that because it's the only message by which anyone can be saved. And so he takes an attack on the gospel, whether by removing something from it or adding something to it, as small as it may be, like circumcision. He takes that very seriously because the souls of men and women are at stake. And so he starts off in the beginning, defending his apostleship. It had been attacked. They were discrediting him, so he says, no, verse 1, right? I'm an apostle, not from men nor through man, but from Jesus Christ and God the Father. They called me, they commissioned me. And we saw last week in verse 6, the purpose statement for the entire letter, the very reason why he's writing, summed up in one sentence. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. That's why he's writing. Their souls are at stake. This is a gospel issue. He says, not that there is another one. We know there's not. And anyone who tries to bring another gospel outside of the gospel of grace, Paul has some very harsh terms and condemnations for them, doesn't he? Ones that were painful to read and to even talk about as we did last week. Because Christians are a people of grace, and we're gracious to one another, and we love one another, and we're patient with one another, and we forgive one another. But not when it comes to false teachers and false gospels. And we saw that Paul twice says, let them be damned to hell for trying to deceive you to hell, in verses 8 and 9. Severe denunciation of these false teachers. Because he loves these Galatians, and he wants them to be saved. And then in verse 10, he says there, does that sound like a man-pleaser? They were accusing him of changing his message to accommodate his audience, right? When he's with the Jews, let's preach the law and circumcision. When I'm with the Gentiles, don't worry about that. It's not part of the gospel. And he says there, does that sound like a man-pleaser to you? Does it sound like I care and am concerned about the opinions of men and women around me and what they think about my message? Or am I serving Christ, he says? Or am I a slave of Christ into the gospel? And now he changes gears slightly in verses 11 through 17. And he goes back to what he started with in verse 1, back to a defense of his apostleship. And specifically a defense along the same lines of his gospel and the source of it, right? In verse 1, he was defending the origin of his apostleship as from Jesus Christ and God the Father. And now in verse 11, he begins to defend the origin of his gospel as the same from Jesus Christ and God the Father. That's his thesis statement, and between now all the way through chapter 2, verse 10, he's going to support that. He's going to support that in various ways, actually, by his own life, but by the transforming power of the gospel as evidenced in his incredible miraculous conversion from being a persecutor of the church to a preacher of the gospel. So he's going to use those as supporting arguments. My life pre-conversion as an enemy of the gospel and a persecutor of Jesus. My conversion experience, which he's going to identify and bring us all back to in the Galatians. And then post-conversion life and the amazing transformation into someone who went from an enemy to an expositor of the gospel, from a persecutor of Jesus to a preacher of Jesus. And we can believe that. So verse 11. For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. Paul loves to use that introductory kind of solemn declaration, for I would have you know, brothers. You need to know this. He uses this often when he really wants his readers and us, by extension, to pay attention. Right? So we can be absolutely, unequivocally sure that what he's about to say is true. For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. And interestingly, he uses it almost in the exact same context in his letter to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 1. He says this to them, now to remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved. Same thing. Except now, he wants them to know about the origin of his gospel. For I would have you know that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. This is not man's gospel. The sense behind this is not a human invention. He's saying, I may have preached this gospel, but I didn't invent it. It didn't originate with me. And if it didn't originate with me, the implication is it originated from God. And he's going to make that abundantly clear in a moment. It's not from me. This is from the Lord. And notice, he calls them brothers. He calls them brothers. Those who in verse 6 he said have quickly deserted Jesus and the gospel of grace. Which means that their desertion and their defection was not complete. It was not final. And certainly Paul didn't believe that, because he still considers them his brothers and by extension sisters. And I think it's instructive for us to sit back at a moment and think about that. To think about not being too quick to write off hastily those believers, especially those near and dear to us, who may have at first glance defected or deserted from the faith. Yeah, it's possible they may have. They may have made that profession. They may have said they don't want anything to do with Jesus or the gospel or with his church and his people, and they don't want to listen to you anymore or talk to you or have anything to do with you. At which point, we don't stop praying for them. We pray for them ceaselessly with intercessory prayer, begging and pleading God on their behalf that he would grant them repentance that would lead to the genuine faith that evidently they never had. We don't stop doing that. But it's also possible that they haven't fully defected and deserted. Perhaps they were introduced to some new teaching by some false preacher or teacher that aroused their curiosity. Now they're intrigued. Now they're interested. They're fascinated by it. But they haven't yet been persuaded by it. And so at that point, we don't give up on them. We don't give up. We talk to them. We save them. We rescue them. Like Jude says in 1:22-23, we rescue them as plucking kindling out of the fire. We rescue them. We don't leave them in that damning heresy and error. We don't leave them on the road to destruction. We rescue them. We talk to them. We sit and listen to this new teaching that they've been introduced to, and then we biblically and gently and graciously respond to it. We snatch them out of the fire. And now Paul continues to elaborate in verse 12 on what he meant by, it's not man's gospel. Verse 12, for I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. That's what he means. This isn't man's gospel. I didn't receive it from any man as though it was merely one of my ancestral traditions in Judaism that was passed down from my forefathers from generation to generation. No. Nor was I taught it by man, he says. This is not what I learned in rabbinic school when I was studying and advancing in Judaism, which he's going to talk about in a minute. This wasn't taught to me in school. No. But, he says, on the other hand, I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. That's what he means by it not being man's gospel. I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ, himself, our Lord and Savior, directly to me. In other words, my gospel is not an invention as though I fabricated it in my own brain. My gospel is not a tradition that was passed down to me by my forefathers. My gospel is a revelation because Jesus Christ directly gave it to me. Wow. You say, wait a second, when did Jesus Christ directly give him his gospel? When did he preach the gospel to Paul? I'm glad you asked. At his conversion. Remember we talked about the Damascus road a couple weeks ago in Acts 9? When he's on his way from Jerusalem with the authorization of the chief priests there to imprison and to persecute Christians in Damascus, and suddenly the risen and glorified Jesus appears to him on the road in all-consuming and blinding and blazing light, and he says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And the rest is history, right? Paul's converted, he's transformed in a moment, he chooses him as his apostle to the Gentiles, and from that moment on, for the rest of the book of Acts, from chapter 9 through the end, Paul now becomes the protagonist, not Peter anymore. Peter resides to the sideline. That's when. You say, well, wait a second, Luke doesn't tell us there that he preaches the gospel to him. No, I think that would be redundant and unnecessary and probably a little awkward. Why? Because seeing the risen Jesus of Nazareth was enough. It was enough. You think Paul hadn't heard the gospel before? You think Paul hadn't heard the gospel from the hundreds and maybe thousands of Christians whom he imprisoned and tortured and condemned to death? You think he hadn't heard it on a number of occasions? He knew the gospel. He knew exactly what these Christians believed. They believed in this Jesus of Nazareth as being the promised Messiah, the Son of God, who was crucified and made atonement for sins and rose from the grave on the third day. He knew that. He just never believed it. Not until the Damascus Road experience and he saw the risen Lord in his glory. Then his eyes were opened and he knew that this Jesus of Nazareth was indeed the promised Messiah and the Son of God. He knew it. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying, I received it directly from Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is both the source and the subject of the gospel, he's saying. Jesus Christ was the revelation, he's saying. Because the gospel is all about him. And when I saw him raised, I knew it was all true. And that's all I needed to know. And now, he changes gears from this incredible revelation directly from the Lord Jesus himself to the evidences that the Galatians and you and I can believe that his gospel is indeed directly from Jesus and from God. And he starts in verse 13, and he starts to talk about his pre-conversion state. And then he's going to talk about the moment when he was converted, and then what his life looked like afterwards as an evidence of the transforming power of this gospel, which he received and was called to preach directly by Jesus himself. Verse 13. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. That was Paul. Do you see the language he's using to describe his former self? This is violent language, aggressive language. In order to advance in his former life of Judaism, he hated the church. He hated Christianity. And therefore, he persecuted them violently, trying to destroy them. He tried to exterminate Christians. He tried to stamp out Christianity. It was a threat to his beloved Judaism. And in case you think he's lying or exaggerating what he did, why don't you turn to the book of Acts, chapter 8. In chapter 7, towards the end, we see that Stephen, that faithful and pious and wise and courageous deacon, he denounces the religious leaders as hypocrites for condemning and killing Jesus the Messiah. And they drag him outside to stone him. And as they do that, they take their garments and they lay them off symbolically at the feet of Saul, because he's the one who was authorizing and approving that. And they stone Stephen to death. And then in chapter 8, verse 1, look what it says. And Saul approved of his execution. And there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him, but Saul was ravaging the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. That's Saul. A few verses later, at the beginning of chapter 9, before his conversion, look what it says. Verse 1. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, that's Christianity, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Does that sound violent to you? And Paul, again, by his own admission, at the end of Acts, in chapter 26, as he's recounting his amazing conversion to King Agrippa I, he says it again in verse 9. I myself was convinced that I ought to do many things in opposing the name of Jesus of Nazareth, and I did so in Jerusalem. I not only locked up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priests, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. And I punished them often in all the synagogues and tried to make them blaspheme, and in raging fury against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. That's Paul. That's Saul pre-conversion. And that's what he did it for. It was all for his Judaism. It was all to advance in his beloved and in his precious religion, false religion. He says so himself in verse 14. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. There you have it. He was so zealous to become the best Jewish Jew possible, according to the Jewish religion, Judaism. He did everything he could. He did everything he could, including persecute the church, which was a threat, and in keeping all the ancestral traditions. So this is beyond just the Old Testament Mosaic law, way beyond that. Right? He's talking about the oral traditions that they had developed and had been passed down from generation to generation and would eventually be codified later in their holy books, religious books like the Talmud, like the Mishnah, and others. He says that's what he was so extremely zealous for. To the point where he's willing to kill other people named Christians and torture them and imprison them. And I think it's important to say now, if you notice, because Paul says he was zealous. Not for the Mosaic law, the law that God mediated through Moses at Mount Sinai and gave to his people. The law had a purpose. The law was good. It was instructive. It was a tutor, and Paul's going to get there in Galatians 3 and 4 and talk about that. Paul doesn't say he was zealous for God's law. He says he was zealous for his ancestral traditions, the traditions of my fathers. It's so important for us to take a step back and say that not all zeal is made equal. Zealousness isn't necessarily a good thing, even among Christians. I know a lot of Christians who are zealous. And I know a lot of Christians who are zealous about all the wrong things. And this zealousness usually shows up exactly like it did for Paul in his pre-conversion state, legalistically for his traditions. They're zealous about all the things that you shouldn't do and all the things you should do, as though those in any way can be pleasing to God and can make you right with God, right? Don't do this because God, you can't do this because God will. You have to do this, otherwise God. Don't. Do. And I can tell you that invariably, every single one of these people, I have never heard them talk about Jesus. I've never heard them talk about the sweetness of Jesus, the loveliness of Jesus, the mercy we have in Jesus, the grace we have in Jesus, the amazing work of Jesus on the cross in their place, at the very least as a motivation for what they do or don't do and are so zealous to do and not do. Not once. And I feel like shaking them. It's like, you're missing the point. Where is Jesus in all this? Where is the gospel in all this? You know, it's possible to be zealous about all the wrong things. Even worse than that, there's another kind of zealousness with some Christians, particularly young Christians, who are zealous, and it shows up in their attitude and approach to Christianity through certain things like this. Oh, I can't sit through a 1 hour long sermon, it's too long. It's too long, or an hour and a half service, church once a week. It's too long. You know, a lot of studies they demonstrate that the average adult attention span is 20 minutes, so. And then they proceed to go home and watch the next new hit TV show on Netflix, an entire season, binge watching in one day. And your attention span is too short? No, I ain't buying that. It's zealousness, desire, all-consuming desire for the wrong things, is the point. And now Paul, he shifts gears from his zealous persecution of the church and his observance and adherence to his ancestral traditions. In other words, his pre-conversion state. And he shifts gears to that moment, that conversion moment on the Damascus road when the risen and glorified Jesus in all his majesty appeared to him. Look what he says in verse 15. But when he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by his grace. Does that language sound familiar? Have you ever read Isaiah 49:1? When Isaiah recounts, or the servant of the Lord through the lips of Isaiah, his calling. Look at Isaiah 49:1. Listen to me, O coastlands, and give attention, you peoples from afar. The Lord called me from the womb. From the body of my mother, he named my name. Wow. And how about Jeremiah, the weeping prophet? At the beginning of his prophecy in his scroll, chapter 1, verse 4, now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you, which means I set you apart. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Wow. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Do you see what Paul's saying here? He's saying, just like the prophets of old and the 12 apostles were directly called by God through Jesus Christ, I also was called by God and appointed way before I was ever born for this purpose. This is not the same calling that we looked at last week in verse 6, where we were talking about that effectual call of God, the gospel call to salvation, by which he draws irresistibly to himself by his grace and through his Spirit all those whom he sovereignly sets his saving love on. No, it's not that kind of a call. He's specifically talking about his call to apostleship here. He's specifically talking about that. And we know that because look what he continues to say in verse 16. But when he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by his grace was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. There you have it right there. He's talking about his call to apostleship. Remember, that's what he's defending. God called me to be an apostle long before I was ever born. He prepared me for this purpose. Just like he says to the Ephesians, right, in that famous gospel passage, actually, right? For we are saved by grace through faith. This not of yourself, it is a gift from God, lest no man might boast. And then the one we always forget in verse 10, that's Ephesians 3, 8, and 9. In verse 10, we often forget it. To walk in the good works which he's prepared for us beforehand, which means before any of us were born. Same thing for Paul. He was called to be an apostle way before he was ever made. And now the Galatians know that, and we know that. His God was pleased to reveal his Son to me. It pleased God to reveal his Son to me. My calling and my gospel did not originate with man. I didn't receive it from man, nor was I taught it from man. It originated with God. He's saying, it is God's good pleasure and his will alone who called me not only to salvation, but who called me long before I was ever made to be his apostle and entrusted me with this gospel message. So you'd better believe it. So that I might preach him among the Gentiles. And then he says this, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. But I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus. What's with this weird geographical cataloging here? He's further emphasizing the point to say, in that moment, at my conversion, I knew Jesus of Nazareth is the risen Lord, Messiah, and Son of God, and I immediately started proclaiming that gospel, proclaiming him to everyone around me, in every city around me, from Damascus to Arabia, which is the Nabatean kingdom, east of Damascus and all the way down through the Sinai Peninsula. He started journeying in that whole area, he's saying. I didn't need anyone to validate it, he says. I didn't even need to go to Jerusalem to get validation from the 12 apostles. I knew it was God and the risen Jesus of Nazareth who called me. And that is all I needed to know, he's saying. And that's all you need to know, Galatians. I wasn't looking for validation and approval from men, not even the apostles. I didn't need it because I'm an apostle. Immediately started proclaiming Jesus as the risen Christ. And we're going to look at the final proofs, more of his testimony post-conversion in the next couple weeks as we pick up in verse 18 and through chapter 2 and verse 10. But that's the transforming power of the gospel. That's what Paul's saying. His message should be believed. He's saying, look what it did to me. See, there's no human explanation for this. He's saying, look at who I was before. Look at how zealously I hated Jesus and I persecuted his people. Look at how zealously I was devoted to my false religion. You think you can explain me going from black to white with a human explanation? He's saying it's impossible. No man, no mere man could have changed my mind, could have changed my heart. And it's true, isn't it? A man in that kind of an emotional state, a mental state, who could possibly have the power to change his psyche, his thinking, his psychology, his theology, his understanding of God, his entire worldview in a moment to go from persecuting Jesus to preaching Jesus? There's no human explanation for that. That's what Paul says. Only the supernatural, divine intervention of God according to his good pleasure and will. That is it. That's his proof. Paul's saying, I'm the proof The power's in the message. Look what it did to me in a moment. And that is the only conclusion we can draw. When we look at who Paul was before he met Jesus on the Damascus road. When we look at that amazing moment, his conversion and calling, at that same time. And then when we look at his life, faithfully proclaiming the gospel and even dying for it in the very end, the only plausible explanation is that his gospel is God's gospel, and it is the power of that gospel that transformed him in a moment and called him as an apostle to preach Christ and him crucified. And in a sense, in a very real sense, every single one of our conversions is miraculous too, isn't it? Because it takes a miracle, right? What else, who else could take us from sin-sick sinners who don't know God, who hate God, and then suddenly take out that rock-hard heart and give us a heart of flesh in a moment, regeneration, conversion, and make us into people who love and serve him? What explanation is there? That's the miracle of regeneration. So all of our testimonies are miraculous. I get that some more than others. Like Paul's here on the Damascus road, it's certainly hard to beat that. I was speaking with a dear brother recently, a dear brother who is a gifted musician, plays several instruments, and evidently an even more gifted producer. And he showed me one of his albums that he produced years ago. And I listened to it, and I was like, wow, this is good stuff. The quality of the production. In and out. All the different layers, the sounds, the acoustics, the vocals, the instruments. You know, a unique blend of everything. Like a little bit of rock, a little bit of psychedelic, a little bit of reggae. It was interesting. But it sounded like it could be something on the radio. So this is amazing. And he told me how he used to be in a band. And so with being in a band and living the life of a rock star, certain things come along with that, right? Like drugs, alcohol, girls. And he'd heard the gospel and the Bible from time to time on the radio over the course of a couple years. And one day, one of his friends, who was also a musician, came over. He happened to be a Christian. And he told him a story from the Bible in the book of Genesis. And something struck him that moment, he said. And after he left the next day, he went and bought a Bible, and he read that story over and over again. And he started devouring the scriptures. And he was never the same. He said he instantly left it all behind. The band, the music, even the drugs, when he had previously tried and never been able to successfully. Why? Because this time he experienced the transforming power of the gospel. And he cut it all off cold turkey through the grace and the power of God. And I said to him, I said, now I know why you didn't make it as a musician or producer, as talented as you were. Because God chose you for himself. God called you to proclaim his gospel and to use the gifts and the talents he's given you for his glory. Just like he called the Apostle Paul and chose him to proclaim the gospel.